The highly distinguished and nationally recognized legislative representative had, throughout the meteoric trajectory of her public service career, actively participated in a remarkably diverse array of intellectually rigorous and profoundly extensive public dialogues she had confidently shared, debate stages and legislative committee rooms with deeply entrenched financial scholars whose entire lives were devoted to the complexities of macroeconomic theory, with seasoned, multi-term legislative senators whose political instincts were meticulously honed over decades of institutional maneuvering, and with the most prominent, sharply articulate television commentators who dominated the relentless high-stakes arena of the Pointer-Ut 24-hour broadcast news cycle. Yet, despite this formidable resume of rhetorical combat, she suddenly found herself navigating a uniquely challenging and fundamentally unprecedented communicative position. She was conversing with a political counterpart whose accents sing plays. Personal background was not rooted in academic abstraction or institutional privilege, but was instead deeply anchored in the profound, visceral realities of severe economic scarcity and systemic generational struggle. This unexpected dynamic presented a vastly complex communicative scenario, a profound clash of epistemologies that standard rhetorical preparations, meticulously crafted talking points, and traditional debate strategies could not entirely anticipate or adequately address. The initial inquiry of this highly anticipated evening was explicitly intended by the organizers to be a highly accessible, gentle, and universally conversational entry point. The hosting television network, a titan of international media broadcasting, had purposefully and strategically arranged this specialized public forum, a symposium, deeply focusing on the shifting economic realities and the future trajectory of the everyday American labor force within a highly symbolic location. They had chosen the vast, quiet, and echoing confines of a formerly bustling, historically significant industrial steel production facility, situated squarely in the heart of the Midwestern landscape, a region deeply scarred by decades of deindustrialization and economic transformation. The seasoned, journalistic moderator, a veteran of countless high-stakes political interviews, initiated the proceedings with what he genuinely and earnestly perceived to be an impartial objective and unifying starting point. He inquired with thoughtful, measured cadence about the contemporary definition, the sociological reality, and the everyday lived experience of the laboring citizen within the modern framework of the nation. The Congresswoman initiated the dialogue with her customary brilliance, presenting herself with profound articulation, deep, resonant enthusiasm, and an absolute unwavering exactness. She projected the very polished, charismatic, and formidable persona that had historically transformed standard, often mundane legislative oversight sessions into widely shared digital phenomena and routine social media broadcasts into significant, culturally defining civic gatherings. She thoughtfully and movingly recounted her past personal experiences, painting a vivid picture of her time serving beverages and managing the chaotic environment of a bustling working-class urban borough. She spoke with passionate intensity about the heavy, suffocating, and enduring burden of educational debt that paralyzes so many young citizens, and she shared the deeply emotional tragic passing of her beloved parent during her highly formative late teenage years. She detailed her dedicated, exhausting efforts holding down multiple demanding employment roles, sacrificing her own immediate comfort to maintain her family's precarious, teetering financial stability during a period of profound crisis. She resonated with every possible sentimental and empathetic chord, displaying the practiced grace, the perfect rhythmic cadence, and the undeniable skill of a gifted orator who had shared this deeply personal foundational narrative on countless public occasions. Her delivery prompted a warmly tutu, affectionate, deeply supportive, and enthusiastic reception from the forward-thinking progressive members of the assembled crowd who recognized and validated her journey. Subsequently, her counterpart, the executive figure, leaned forward with a palpable sense of gravity and deliberate purpose. He directed his gaze deliberately past the high-definition television lenses, beyond the familiar face of the seasoned moderator, and straight toward the expansive, towering industrial windows that overlooked a vast, currently vacant expanse of cracked asphalt. This was the precise location where he noted, with quiet reverence, his ancestor had once faithfully parked his vehicle every single morning. At the harsh, unforgiving break of dawn, he softly requested the audience, and by extension, the millions watching at home, to truly observe the very architecture surrounding them, the silent steel beams and the Tessin, dormant machinery. He noted that his grandfather had dedicated countless decades of his physical vitality and life to that specific demanding enterprise, having relocated from a humble, geographically isolated Appalachian community with virtually no material possessions, carrying only the most foundational rudimentary education. He explained that his grandfather had entered into matrimony during a vastly different, far more demanding, historical era, seeking nothing more than the dignity of honest labor. He detailed how that consistent, grueling employment in the intense heat of metal production, characterized by an unwavering stoic daily attendance, regardless of physical fatigue or illness, provided the solid economic foundation necessary to purchase a modest home, to faithfully nurture a growing family, and to offer his descendant a genuine fighting opportunity at a life of stability. Tragically, he continued, his mother ultimately found that very life too overwhelmingly complex and emotionally taxing to navigate successfully. His vocal delivery remained entirely composed, devoid of theatrical fluctuation. Yet it intentionally and noticeably slowed, demanding the absolute attention of the room. He explained that his mother had initially held a respectable, vital, and steady position in the medical caregiving field, a role of profound societal value, before tragically falling into a devastating, inescapable pattern of severe pharmaceutical dependency. This agonizing descent, initially sparked by accessible medications, tragically escalated into far more severe, deeply destructive substance reliance. Mirroring the wider epidemic that had ravaged similar communities, he shared the harrowing, deeply traumatic memory of witnessing her experience a critical, life-threatening medical emergency, a catastrophic, physiological failure in a cold clinical parking area. During his highly vulnerable pre-adolescent years, it was a chaotic, terrifying event that required immediate, desperate emergency intervention by paramedics, and which, unfortunately, was merely a prelude to multiple agonizingly similar crises in the subsequent deeply unstable months. The expansive, cavernous industrial space fell completely, profoundly silent. The atmosphere was contextual, entirely devoid of any supportive clapping partisan, cheering, or even hushed whispered conversations. There was only the heavy, resonant sound of an individual speaking candidly and without pretense about his family's profound generational struggles within the very architectural walls where their ambitious aspirations for prosperity had initially blossomed with such promise and ultimately heartbreakingly withered. He continued his deeply introspective reflection, noting the persistent absence of his father figure from a remarkably young formative age. He articulated that this absence was not felt as a dramatic, sudden departure or a singular, traumatic event. but simply as a persistent, echoing void, a permanent lack of presence in his developmental years. Meanwhile, his remaining guardian, deeply compromised by her own internal battles, navigated a rapid, chaotic succession of romantic partnerships that unfortunately mirrored the unpredictable transience of her temporary employment situations. He described with careful, measured words how each passing companion seemed to introduce new, increasingly complex difficulties into their domestic environment, eventually culminating in terrifying instances of physical domestic turbulence. These severe escalations compelled him as a mere child to adopt stringent, heartbreaking personal security measures within the supposed sanctuary of his own childhood bedroom, living in a state of constant, vigilant apprehension. After a brief, deeply contemplative pause that allowed the weight of his words to settle over the audience, the speaker shifted his narrative focus to the stabilizing foundational presence of his grandmother. He described her as a fiercely protective, indomitable figure hailing from the rugged, unforgiving eastern mountainous regions. She was, he noted, petite in physical stature, weighing remarkably little, yet she possessed a formidable, unyielding spirit. She carried personal absolute, means of defense within her belongings, and expressed an unwavering, unconditional commitment to his physical safety, promising to neutralize any threat that dared approach him. He playfully and warmly added that her fierce, protective nature also extended with equal intensity to strict, uncompromising academic discipline. It was a light-hearted, humanizing recollection of tough love that elicited a gentle, appreciative, and culturally resonant murmur of laughter from the gathered attendees, leading him to affirm with a slight smile that he indeed without fail completed his educational obligations under her watchful, demanding eye. The dialogue then experienced a gentle, almost hesitant, yet entirely intentional and strategic transition. He respectfully, almost deferentially acknowledged his distinguished colleague's history in the challenging hospitality sector. He validated her previous employment as deeply honorable, necessary labor, carefully drawing parallel connections to his own foundational experiences, performing arduous custodial duties, organizing inventory, and completing unglamorous maintenance tasks prior to his transformative military enlistment, expressing a deep philosophical commitment to absolute unfiltered transparency for the ultimate benefit of the watching public. He stated that the citizens fundamentally deserved honesty over rhetoric. He produced a single, unadorned documentary reference, utilizing it to softly, yet firmly, contrast the widely accepted public narrative of her profound urban struggle with the objective, verifiable demographic and historical records. He carefully and deliberately articulated that while her origins were indeed geographically located in the aforementioned urban borough, her family had strategically relocated during her early childhood to a substantially more affluent, culturally distinct suburban environment. This new environment, he noted, was characterized by a remarkably comfortable, highly stable median household prosperity metric, far removed from the daily anxieties of profound poverty. He meticulously noted her parents' professional standing as an independent entrepreneurial architectural practitioner, a role indicating significant, specialized education and social capital. Furthermore, he highlighted her subsequent enrollment in a prestigious, historically elite, and exceptionally high tuition private university. He systematically posited that her time engaged in the hospitality industry actually followed the successful acquisition of a highly valuable door-opening academic credential from this elite institution. Placing the documentary evidence carefully down upon the table, he explicitly and compassionately stated that his intention was absolutely not to invalidate or minimize her genuine personal hardships. He emphasized with evident sincerity that the premature, unexpected loss of a parent represents a profound, unmitigated, and life-altering sorrow, an emotional devastation that he could deeply, personally empathize with, given his own complex, painful experiences with familial absences and abandonment. However, he respectfully but firmly proposed that a substantive, undeniable sociological distinction exists between encountering economic friction or career delays subsequent to obtaining a premium elite tertiary education, and facing those exact same socioeconomic frictions as a permanent, lifelong substitute for such transformative educational opportunities. He further, with precise language, delineated the vast existential contrast between engaging in service work while safely possessing a collegiate degree as a robust safety net, and performing those identical physically demanding tasks because they represent the absolute zenith of localized economic opportunity, determined entirely by the misfortune of one's geographical zip code. Ultimately, he drew a stark, philosophical line between the noble act of voluntarily choosing to advocate for the laboring demographic from a position of acquired privilege, and the inescapable reality of inherently, irrevocably belonging to that demographic, with no alternative avenues for advancement. The representative possessing lightning-fast political reflexes and deep conviction immediately offered a spirited, highly articulate defense of her personal history. She passionately asserted that her upbringing was entirely devoid of immense inherited privilege, strongly emphasizing that her suburban community, while stable, was absolutely not synonymous with extreme insulating wealth or elite extravagance. She vividly recounted the severe, terrifying financial recalibrations and profound sacrifices her family was forced to endure following her father's tragic, untimely passing. She detailed the grueling, exhausting hours she dedicated to the service industry, a desperate attempt to stave off financial ruin and ensure the basic survival of her family unit during their darkest hour. The executive figure, then, with a calm, unshakable demeanor, gently contrasted her subsequent remarkable ascension to the highest echelons of legislative office, with his own dramatically different trajectory involving deployment to a distant, perilous conflict zone. This comparison caused a palpable, heavy hush to fall completely over the massive industrial room. He explained with stark vulnerability his complete inability to finance any form of higher education straight out of secondary, a financial impossibility that directly prompted his enlistment in the armed forces. He described finding himself at a highly formative, impressionable age, stationed entirely alone in a desolate desert environment, many thousands of miles away from the familiar sights of his Midwestern hometown. It was in this unforgiving environment, he noted, that he internalized the profound, foundational realization that the broader, harsher world fundamentally prioritizes reliable physical presence, shared collective responsibility, and the urgent necessity of communal preservation over perfectly crafted, refined rhetorical arguments or academic theories. Looking directly with unflinching eye contact at his esteemed counterpart, he observed that while both of their respective trajectories, one progressing from the challenges of the service industry to the powerful halls of national governance, the other navigating from deep economic hardship through the crucible of military service to public leadership, were distinctly and beautifully American narratives. He felt a profound moral necessity to maintain absolute rigorous alignment between one's carefully curated public presentation and their fundamental, unvarnished, lived reality. The Congresswoman instinctively adjusted her physical posture, gathering her intellectual resources to deliver her most potent, sharply honed counter-argument of the entire evening. With precision, she highlighted his current, undeniable high-ranking executive status, drawing stark attention to the substantial multi-million-dollar financial success he had derived from the publication of his widely read memoirs. She further pointed out his previous highly lucrative tenure in the elite, exclusive technology investment sector of the Western Coast, utilizing these facts to forcefully question the ongoing validity and authenticity of his continued identification with the economically disadvantaged working class. The audience, visibly and audibly, reacted to the sheer intellectual weight and incisive nature of her point, recognizing its undeniable merit and strategic brilliance. The executive, completely unruffled by the attack, gracefully and immediately acknowledged the truth of her statement, without a single moment of hesitation or defensive maneuvering. He openly and plainly conceded his current state of immense financial stability, even humorously and self-deprecatingly noting the inherent, almost literary irony of achieving extraordinary personal prosperity, specifically through the authoring of a literary exploration, detailing the agonizing realities of deep poverty. This moment of disarming self-aware reflection generated a wave of sincere, appreciative amusement from the otherwise tense crowd. However, he gently, yet with absolute firmness, drew a profound, uncrossable distinction by emphasizing the enduring psychological permanence of his formative memories. He spoke of the distinct, unforgettable sensory recollection of utility disconnections during the harsh, freezing depths of winter, the degrading necessity of consuming breakfast cereals for evening meals due to completely depleted pantries, and the poignant, heartbreaking sight of his guardian meticulously, anxiously calculating fractional metallic currency on a worn kitchen table, merely to afford essential transportation fuel for the week. He articulated with deep, emotional resonance that such profoundly ingrained traumatic experiences of scarcity remain fundamentally unaltered and psychologically active, regardless of any subsequent radical shifts in financial ascendance or bank account balances. He firmly, unequivocally stated that his current legislative frameworks and policy philosophies are derived directly, organically from those visceral, painful memories, rather than being lifted from academic textbooks, viral social media trends, or the highly manicured performative atmosphere of high-profile charitable gala appearances. That specific culturally loaded phrase regarding elite galas was instantly destined to dominate digital discourse and fracture the Internet's attention. But before the anticipated cultural resonance could fully explosively materialize, the speaker methodically and deliberately engaged with her proposed highly detailed policy architectures. He did this in a deeply surprising, entirely unanticipated manner, by expressing profound, almost total agreement with her fundamental structural diagnosis of the economy. As the moderator attempted to transition the structured discussion toward the vast complexities of systemic economic disparities, the Congresswoman elegantly and powerfully articulated her comprehensive, progressive critique. She spoke forcefully against rampant corporate consolidation, the systemic tax avoidance orchestrated by the ultra-wealthy, the rapidly, dangerously widening prosperity gaps, and the fundamentally structurally imbalanced economic frameworks that penalized the laborer. Her delivery was exceptionally fluid, deeply and genuinely passionate, and completely supported by a robust, overwhelming array of statistical data that she had masterfully and flawlessly committed to memory. She effortlessly cited complex executive compensation ratios, alarming real wage stagnation metrics, and the terrifying widening divergence between skyrocketing residential costs and stagnant income generation, it stood without question as the absolute pinnacle, the most refined and expertly delivered version of the progressive economic philosophy possible, to which her counterpart respectfully, silently listened, before slowly, deliberately nodding in genuine, unfeigned affirmation. He clearly and loudly stated to the massive room that her overarching assessment of a fundamentally fractured, deeply unfair system was entirely objectively accurate. This sudden, profound concession caused a momentary shocked stillness to settle over the massive industrial venue momentarily, surprising both his seasoned legislative counterpart and the highly experienced journalistic moderator, who quickly looked up from his prepared notes. He continued to validate her keen observations, agreeing unequivocally that everyday hard-working laborers were facing severe systemic disadvantages, that the grotesque disparity between executive remuneration and worker compensation was morally and economically untenable, and that substantive immediate structural adjustments were urgently and desperately required. He grounded this surprising agreement firmly in his own developmental experiences, noting that he had grown up trapped within the very fractured, broken system she was so eloquently and statistically describing. He stated emphatically that he required no complex, multicolored statistical visualizations or academic charts to confirm its existence, because it was the inescapable breathing reality of his entire upbringing. Having masterfully established this entirely unexpected, disarming common ground, he then carefully, surgically delineated their profound, irreconcilable divergence regarding the appropriate, effective, prescriptive measures necessary to heal the nation. He directed the audience's attention specifically to her highly ambitious signature environmental and economic proposal, citing diverse, credible financial projections that estimated its total implementation costs at an astronomical, almost incomprehensible, tens of trillions of dollars over a single decade. He engaged in a simplified yet devastatingly effective mathematical exercise, taking the theoretical midpoint of those staggering projected expenditures and dividing them evenly by a total number of active contributing individuals in the national workforce. This calculation illustrated a theoretical crushing individual burden of tens of thousands of dollars annually per worker. Gesturing expansively toward the local attendees seated in the shadows of the factory, he gently, respectfully pointed out that the median household income in their specific struggling municipality was remarkably close to that very figure of the proposed individual tax burden. He suggested with quiet devastation that requesting individuals to theoretically fund a government program that mathematically mirrors their entire combined annual earning capacity represents a catastrophic mathematical miscalculation. It is a policy that, rather than representing progressive advancement, would precipitate severe, widespread residential instability and absolute financial ruin for the very people it claimed to champion. The representative immediately interjected, her voice ringing with conviction to clarify and defend her funding mechanism. She asserted that the massive program would rely entirely on comprehensive, aggressive wealth taxation, explicitly targeting the most affluent billionaire-class citizens, alongside the complete unapologetic elimination of all corporate tax leniencies and loopholes. She accurately and forcefully noted the staggering, almost unfathomable, multi-trillion-dollar cumulative net worth of the nation's absolute wealthiest individuals. To this, her counterpart responded by calmly outlining a hypothetical extreme scenario of total unmitigated asset confiscation to test the mathematical limits of her theory. Lesson: he argued with chilling logic that even the complete, forcible liquidation of every single luxury estate, every maritime vessel, and every last financial instrument belonging to the ultra-wealthy, leaving them entirely destitute, would only generate enough capital to sustain her massively expensive proposed initiatives for a mere matter of months. He posited, leaning heavily on historical precedent, that upon the inevitable rapid depletion of those finite upper echelon resources, the crushing financial burden would historically, invariably, and predictably shift downward, directly onto the shoulders of the middle income. Demographics. This, he explained, was a simple function of mathematics. The uppermost tier simply lacks the sheer numerical density and liquid capital to perpetually endlessly finance such expansive utopian civic promises, advancing his critique. From the theoretical to the painfully concrete, he referenced a highly specific, controversial historical incident that occurred directly within her own legislative district. He brought up the widely publicized withdrawal of a major globally dominant technology corporation's proposed secondary headquarters, an event he characterized not as a progressive victory, but as the tragic, senseless forfeiture of tens of thousands of highly compensated, life-changing employment opportunities. He thoughtfully and painfully contrasted the perception of these specialized roles, which she had dismissed as exclusive only to the already affluent, in her hyper-competitive urban environment, with how such remarkable opportunities would be celebrated as a profound, miraculous economic revitalization in struggling, desperate Midwestern municipalities like the one they currently occupied. He suggested with a hint of sorrow that her vehement opposition to the project stemmed from a fundamental philosophical conflation of strategic, necessary tax incentives designed to spur growth with direct, unearned fiscal subsidies, a devastating misinterpretation that ultimately resulted in her own constituents losing out on transformational, generational, regional investments. The Congresswoman vehemently, fiercely defended her stance, refusing to yield an inch. She categorized the proposed corporate arrangement as entirely inappropriate, unethical corporate subsidization for one of the most globally dominant, wildly profitable entities on the planet, framing her opposition as a moral stand against corporate greed. Prompted by her defense, he gently, yet incisively, inquired about the ultimate real-world destination of those displaced, highly desirable employment opportunities. He reminded the audience, ensuring the facts were laid bare, that neighboring boroughs and adjacent more pragmatically governed municipalities ultimately secured those exact same corporate facilities and the associated economic boom. He pointed out the harsh reality that her specific immediate constituency was left with absolutely nothing but an empty victory, a stark, undeniable development. She had nonetheless publicly and visibly celebrated on her vast digital platforms with a photographic demeanor he perceived and characterized as overly contented and politically smug. Reclining slightly in his chair, changing the physical dynamic of the debate, he masterfully summarized their deeply philosophical conflict. He noted their shared, urgent recognition of a critical, burning societal emergency, yet sharply contrasted her revolutionary desire to entirely deconstruct the existing flawed framework in an attempt to build an unattainable, impossibly expensive ideal castle. With his own grounded, pragmatic preference for executing practical, foundational structural repairs. His solution, he argued, was to fix the metaphorical plumbing and rewire the existing electricity fundamentally executed by the class. Citizens themselves, provided the government simply granted on them the autonomy, the respect, and the freedom to do so. The gathered audience, comprising a highly diverse historically complex coalition of local trade union members and multi-generational industrial families offered profound visual signs of agreement. They were clearly deeply responding to his unique, unparalleled ability to translate incredibly complex, abstract, legislative concepts into immediately accessible, kitchen-table realities with devastating, emotionally resonant, communicative efficacy. The highly experienced moderator, sensing the deep shifting currents of the room, attempted to quickly guide the discourse toward the universally critical topic of healthcare infrastructure. However, the executive remained entirely strategically focused on exploring the profound underlying cultural and socio-economic dimensions of the divide, introducing a specific, highly visual topic that was guaranteed to resonate extensively across all media channels for the subsequent week. With meticulous, quiet precision, he brought up a highly exclusive, extravagantly expensive, fashion-centric philanthropic event she had prominently attended in the heart of the metropolitan center. As he introduced the topic, he noted subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her facial expression, the involuntary tightening that accompanies the dreadful anticipation of an unavoidable, perfectly aimed critique that cannot be deflected. He detailed with exact figures the extraordinary, exclusionary, financial barrier to entry required simply to step foot inside the gathering. He vividly described the customized, breathtakingly expensive designer garment she had chosen to wear, which prominently and ironically featured a highly provocative, politically charged slogan advocating for aggressively increased taxation on the very wealthy individuals surrounding her. He painted an incredibly vivid atmospheric picture of the opulent, intoxicating environment of the gala, characterized by an overwhelming concentration of global celebrities, unimaginable billionaire wealth, relentless media photographers, and a level of sheer, unadulterated luxury that is entirely fundamentally foreign and inaccessible to the vast, overwhelming majority of the hard-working national populace, producing a tangible visual aid. A high-quality photograph, perfectly capturing her radiant presence on the event's prestigious, highly photographed arrival corridor, completely surrounded by the glittering ambiance of premium, elite celebrations. He placed it visibly and deliberately on the Avenot's table where every camera could capture it. While doing so, he calmly, methodically recounted subsequent highly embarrassing findings from internal legislative ethics oversight committees. These formal inquiries, he noted, had strongly suggested potential troubling discrepancies regarding the payment of full market compensation for the extensive, highly specialized cosmetic and preparatory services she had received for the event. He pointed out the profound irony that the independent, working-class artisans, the hairstylists, the makeup professionals, the individuals who performed the actual physical labor to facilitate her glamorous appearance experienced significant stressful delays, spanning months before receiving their rightful negotiated remuneration. He highlighted that one such professional was reportedly driven to the point of contemplating formal legal grievance procedures simply to secure payment for services rendered. Without pausing for breath, he then produced a second profoundly contrasting image: locality. It depicted an anonymous woman clad in simple medical scrubs, exiting a stark discount retail establishment, carrying basic plastic bags against the backdrop of a tragically shuttered, decaying storefront. There was absolutely no champagne, no prestigious red carpet, and certainly no designer garments in sight. He described this anonymous individual with deep reverence as his neighbor, a dedicated, indispensable home healthcare professional earning a modest, grueling, hourly wage. He detailed that she navigated her demanding life driving a heavily utilized older model vehicle with immensely high mileage, and that she had never in her entire life experienced the overwhelming grandeur of the metropolis, or even encountered a single piece of clothing exceeding the total value of her primary mode of transportation. He then emphasized a profound, devastating moral and cultural distinction by noting that this specific healthcare worker, despite facing constant suffocating financial constraints, consistently, reliably, and punctually compensates her own local personal care providers. She pays them in direct, physical currency entirely on time every single month, reflecting a deeply held foundational ethical principle of the true laboring community, the absolute necessity of honoring immediate financial obligations and respecting the labor of one's peers. Placing the two vastly different visual artifacts directly adjacent to one another on the table, he summarized the stark, inescapable juxtaposition for the audience and the cameras. He pointed out the profound hypocrisy of advocating for radical wealth redistribution, while fully immersed in the very epicenter of extreme exclusive affluence, adorned in partially compensated elite luxury attire, while simultaneously the essential, everyday laborers she claims to represent prioritize the timely, honest payment of their immediate debts above all else. Reflecting on his own highly limited and deeply uncomfortable exposure to such elite rarefied social environments, he shared a profoundly vulnerable, highly relatable anecdote from his early postgraduate education involving a formal, highly intimidating academic dinner at a prestigious law school. He described with painful honesty the profound, paralyzing discomfort of feeling entirely alienated and culturally inadequate. Quietly and anxiously observing the wealthy students around him, simply to decipher the complex, unspoken behavioral choreography down to the specific usage of silverware of a prestigious insider world he had previously never been invited to access. He underscored his devastating point by stating that during his moment of deepest, most acute social insecurity and imposter syndrome, he absolutely abstained from adopting adversarial, hypocritical attire, demanding the destruction of his hosts while simultaneously partaking in their luxurious hospitality. Framing such behavior as fundamentally morally inconsistent with the straightforward, honest values of his modest upbringing, he gently, yet relentlessly enumerated the undeniable markers of her current, highly privileged lifestyle: her premium high-status electric transportation, her upscale, highly secure residential accommodations, and her substantial congressional income that definitively placed her in the uppermost elite decile of national earners. He suggested with quiet finality that she had seamlessly, entirely integrated into the very socio-economic elite echelon she routinely, loudly criticizes in her political messaging. He openly and honestly acknowledged his own current undeniable affluence, asserting that the critical defining divergence between them lay not in the current balance of their bank accounts, but in his absolute refusal to obscure, deny, or apologize for his present reality. The representative, fighting fiercely for her political identity, countered by reaffirming with rising emotion her foundational origins in a financially strained working-class environment, insisting with absolute passion that she remained deeply spiritually connected to those original roots. The executive, however, quietly and factually reiterated the objective demographic realities of her childhood suburban community, gently but firmly asserting that her participation in elite cultural events and her current lifestyle represented her actual current destination rather than her origin point. He offered genuine, seemingly sincere praise for the unique, beautiful American mobility that permits an individual to transition from the grueling hospitality sector to the most exclusive, philanthropic gatherings in the world. Yet he immediately cautioned against the cognitive dissonance of maintaining a hostile adversarial aesthetic, while fully enthusiastically participating in, benefiting from those heavily guarded, privileged spaces. He respectfully but devastatingly suggested she harmonize her public rhetorical narrative with her actual material reality, proposing that her choice of transportation, her residence, and her elite social calendar reflected a profound, undeniable level of success that entirely contradicted her carefully curated, heavily marketed political messaging of constant, ongoing struggle. He concluded this remarkable segment by asserting to the absolute silence of the room that she was engaging in a highly stylized, performative impersonation of economic struggle, a cosplay of the working class, whereas he and the countless individuals associated with the surrounding Rust Belt industrial landscape possessed an innate, experiential, and inescapable understanding of authentic hardship that could absolutely never be replicated through clever political strategy or social media branding. The profound, heavy quiet that immediately blanketed the massive room was infinitely more impactful and terrifying than any potential roar of applause. It was the deep, contemplative silence of a forgotten community, hearing its most complex, painful internal sentiments, articulated with profound, stunning clarity by an individual who shared their exact, authentic dialect of experience, rather than the polished, focus-grouped vocabulary of traditional political authority. In that heavy quietude, the representative, perhaps, for the first time in her meteoric career, appeared to recognize a fundamental shifting dynamic that absolutely no amount of rigorous late-night debate preparation could alter. She was engaged not merely in a standard policy dispute over taxation or infrastructure, but in a profound existential encounter with an undeniable, deeply rooted lived reality that effectively completely neutralized standard ideological frameworks and progressive talking points. Following a brief, highly necessary commercial interruption, which allowed the panicked network producers time to process the rapidly escalating, unprecedented digital engagement surrounding the devastating stylized performance critique, the moderator desperately attempted to anchor the spiraling conversation. In highly specific traditional legislative proposals, he introduced with forced calm the standard debate topics of federally mandated wage minimums, the crisis of educational debt, and the complexities of infrastructural energy strategies. However, the executive consistently, masterfully transformed these abstract, dry, systemic queries into deeply resonant, highly emotional personal narratives featuring identifiable individuals with names and faces, effectively converting theoretical distant policy into tangible, immediate human impact that felt like a physical blow. When addressing the proposed controversial federal wage increase, the Congresswoman delivered a beautifully structured, highly moral defense. She emphasized the inherent dignity of human labor, the terrifying rising costs of basic existence, and the absolute moral imperative that full-time employment should unconditionally guarantee economic security and freedom from poverty. It was a well-reasoned, flawlessly delivered, and impeccably rehearsed argument. The executive offered a respectful, thoughtful nod before immediately sharing a highly specific formative memory of his teenage employment at a modest, locally owned grocery establishment in his hometown. He described the proprietor, Mr. Dillman, not as a cartoonish, greedy capitalist, but as a fundamentally decent, hard-working individual operating an enterprise with incredibly fragile razor-thin profit margins. He explained with basic arithmetic how this small, vital community enterprise struggled daily to compete with massive, soulless corporate retailers situated just down the road, entities capable of absorbing massive financial losses on staple goods simply to drive out local competition. He illustrated with painful clarity that a federally mandated wage increase would have forced the decent proprietor to terminate staff members not out of malice, greed, or a desire for higher profits, but due to inescapable cold mathematical reality that simply does not negotiate with progressive ideals. He argued passionately that while monolithic multi-billion-dollar corporations can easily, painlessly absorb drastically increased labor costs, and often already pay above those minimums, neighborhood enterprises absolutely cannot. Therefore, he concluded her proposed policy would lead to the inevitable tragic closure of small family-owned businesses and the unintentional devastating consolidation of total market power into the hands of the very corporate giants she so frequently loudly criticized. When the discussion inevitably transitioned to the highly charged topic of the forgiveness of educational loans, the representative advocated for expansive universal relief, portraying it as a necessary economic liberation from a predatory system to be funded entirely through targeted wealth assessments. In devastating response, her counterpart introduced the deeply personal story of a close military associate, a man who served honorably alongside him in a combat zone, specifically chose a grueling career in the skilled electrical trades immediately following his honorable discharge, deliberately bypassing formal university education while consistently, without complaint, fulfilling his civic tax obligations year after year. He suggested painting a vivid picture of systemic unfairness that under her highly touted proposed framework, the hard-earned financial contributions of working-class individuals, veterans, and tradesmen who deliberately avoided the trap of educational debt would be unjustly utilized to directly subsidize the massive financial obligations of those who voluntarily, eagerly pursued highly expensive elite private instruction, many of whom were now achieving substantial six-figure professional compensation. As lawyers or consultants, he reflected openly on his own heavy reliance on academic scholarships to access elite institutions, noting firmly that without such vital support, he would have proudly and honorably joined his military brother in the skilled trades. He asserted, with absolute moral clarity, that expecting non-participating working-class citizens to forcibly finance the elite academic pursuits of others entirely contradicts the fundamental deep-seated principles of fairness and equity embedded in the very communities she claimed to represent. The Congresswoman passionately, almost desperately, defended higher education as a universal necessary public benefit, requiring massive collective investment to ensure national competitiveness. To this, he gracefully, yet sharply replied, by aggressively encouraging deep systemic reforms to address the actual root cause of the crisis. The astronomical, unjustified inflation of tuition costs, and the massive, wasteful administrative expansion within universities over the last 2 decades. He accused her of wanting to simply transfer the massive financial consequences of a fundamentally flawed, broken system onto the broader public, without fixing the underlying disease, characterizing her plan not as a solution but as a guaranteed subscription to a recurring endless financial disaster. Regarding highly complex national energy initiatives, she presented a sweeping, comprehensive, and terrifying vision, addressing the urgent existential realities of catastrophic environmental changes, promising a robust, immediate transition to sustainable green technologies and the simultaneous creation of millions of equitable, well-paying jobs. The executive listened with deliberate, intense attention, explicitly expressing his own sincere belief in verifiable environmental realities, the undeniable necessity of sustainable forward-thinking investment. Yet, he strongly, viscerally objected to the immediate, reckless displacement and destruction of traditional reliable energy workers long before any viable dissession. Alternative economic structures or replacement jobs were fully matured or even existent. Gesturing once more with a sweeping motion of his arm toward the dormant, rusting industrial architecture. Surrounding them, he powerfully reminded the audience of the substantial, family-sustaining incomes those very facilities once reliably provided. He warned, with a dark intensity, against the premature, ideologically driven dismantling of vital fossil fuel, coal mining, and pipeline sectors across the entire region. He articulated two primary, devastatingly pragmatic concerns. Firstly, the current undeniable insufficient scale and availability of the promised replacement green energy employment. And secondly, the absolute inability of active, hard-working individuals to simply pause their immense financial obligations, such as monthly mortgages, vehicle payments, and the feeding of their children, while waiting for a ponce of butter, theoretical future green economy to magically materialize. He recounted, with profound empathy, a deeply moving face-to-face conversation with a seasoned aging coal miner from the Appalachian region. He described how the physical toll from decades of grueling subterranean labor made the elite metropolitan suggestion of transitioning to highly technical computer programming seem not just profoundly disconnected from his reality, but actively insulting. He highlighted the massive, unbridgeable disconnect between comfortable, isolated metropolitan policy designers and the actual, struggling rural laborers they sought to transition. He strongly cautioned against prioritizing grand ideological ambition over the practical immediate stability and survival of vulnerable communities. He advocated instead for the massive expansion of reliable high-yield zero-emission nuclear infrastructure and heavily funded highly realistic transition programs, rather than offering empty, distant assurances to individuals who had already experienced the crushing devastation of sudden industrial collapse. He concluded this devastating policy critique by softly yet firmly observing that policy frameworks appearing brilliant and visionary in cosmopolitan elite intellectual circles often sound fundamentally reckless, out of touch, and deeply unworkable in Midwestern working-class households, desperately struggling with basic monthly utility maintenance, marking a profound, irreconcilable divergence in fundamental perspective. Throughout these intense rapid-fire exchanges, the executive maintained an incredibly impressive, almost unnatural equanimity. He secured the palpable, deeply emotional alignment of the local attendees while leaving the progressive observers, both in the room and online, unusually quiet and deeply contemplative. Sensing an irreversible catastrophic shift in the debate's momentum, the moderator desperately attempted to provide the representative with a much-needed opportunity to regain her footing by highlighting her concrete, verifiable legislative achievements since her highly publicized inauguration. She responded with a robust, lengthy enumeration of hundreds of introduced bills, prestigious committee assignments, dedicated constituent advocacy, and her unparalleled, generation-defining ability to elevate critical issues, ranging from environmental policy to complex immigration reform, within the national consciousness. Through highly sophisticated viral digital engagement, it was objectively a genuinely strong, articulate defense of a modern, highly communicative approach to political governance. The executive respectfully, without condescension, validated her formidable, undeniable work ethic and her sincere, passionate intentions. However, he immediately pivoted with lethal precision to a rigorous examination of tangible, localized material outcomes rather than national digital advocacy. He referenced highly specific, unarguable demographic and economic data directly from her own constituency. He highlighted once again the previously mentioned catastrophic loss of massive corporate investment. The subsequent tragic closure of thousands of small enterprises during recent severe global health challenges, rapidly escalating residential and nutritional costs, outstripping the national average and rising, deeply concerning safety issues in her district. He gently, yet devastatingly contextualized her entire tenure by noting the massive statistical disparity between her extensive, prolific legislative introductions and her incredibly minimal successfully enacted laws. He pointed out with quiet emphasis that her most prominent finalized legislative action over years of service involved the mere renaming of a local federal postal facility. He sharply contrasted this performance with his own more targeted approach during his legislative tenure, focusing entirely on securing highly specific vital funding for regional addiction treatment facilities and fighting aggressively for targeted manufacturing protections. He readily acknowledged that while his efforts were imperfect and did not solve every problem, they were intensely purely focused on addressing the immediate, desperate material needs of specific struggling communities rather than generating headlines. He thoughtfully and devastatingly suggested that while her massive national profile was masterfully and undeniably built upon viral digital moments, carefully curated social media posts, and cultural relevance, it entirely lacked the tour de zeitgeist necessary foundational support of actual enacted transformative legislation. He argued to the nodding agreement of the crowd that simply raising awareness does absolutely nothing to resolve actual physical infrastructural decay or cure localized crushing economic stagnation. The Congresswoman offered a compelling, highly academic counter-argument regarding the vital importance of movement, politics, and the slow, necessary, gradual shifting of the acceptable public discourse known as the Overton window, asserting that altering the broader cultural conversation is an absolute prerequisite for eventual long-lasting systemic change. He received this complex perspective thoughtfully, granting its theoretical long-term value, but swiftly and brutally returned the focus to the immediate human element. He noted that long-term theoretical, cultural shifts offer absolutely zero comfort to a desperate small business owner facing immediate bankruptcy or a struggling family, mourning the loss of a transformational six-figure employment opportunity simply because the corporate source was deemed ideologically impure. He then utilized a contemporary, highly loaded term to describe her political methodology, suggesting with a calm certainty that she operated more as a high-profile, attention-seeking digital influencer than a traditional, effective legislator. He sharply contrasted her undeniable mastery of the ephemeral cultural conversation with his own deeply rooted commitment to ensuring that historically overlooked decaying regions finally receive tangible material federal acknowledgement. The statement the influencer critique elicited a profound, visceral, and incredibly loud reaction from the local audience, giving massive, undeniable voice to years of latent, deeply held regional frustration and feelings of political invisibility. In a culminating, highly dramatic gesture that broke every rule of standard debate formatting, he completely departed from his designated position. Behind the desk, he approached the very edge of the stage to speak directly, intimately, and without barriers to the audience gathered on the historic stained concrete floor. He bypassed the traditional restrictive debate format to address not just the room, but the millions of viewers residing in the historically overlooked, economically devastated, industrial municipalities spread across the entire nation, directly acknowledging their profound, enduring weariness with distant, empty political promises of effortless government-mandated salvation. He recalled with visible emotion the foundational, hard-earned wisdom of his fiercely independent grandmother, who had imparted to him the incredibly difficult essential truth that genuine, lasting stability requires profound, unyielding self-reliance rather than perpetual helpless dependence on complex, poorly understood, and massive legislative interventions designed by strangers in a distant capital. He credited the rigorous, structured discipline and immense physical demands of his military service for providing a desperately needed functional framework for his chaotic life, emphasizing the enduring fundamental values of absolute consistency, strenuous effort, unshakable personal accountability, and deep communal support as the true, only reliable engines of actual societal progress. He detailed his rapid, highly disciplined progression through higher education, facilitated entirely by military benefits earned through sacrifice, and his subsequent jarring immersion in elite, incredibly wealthy academic environments where he felt profoundly existentially out of place. He explained that this feeling of alienation ultimately led to his crucial decision to document his community's ignored, misunderstood narrative. He clarified, rejecting any notion of personal exceptionalism, that his massive literary success stemmed absolutely not from the uniqueness or brilliance of his specific story, but entirely from its heartbreaking universality among millions of unseen, struggling citizens who desperately yearned for authentic representation. Returning to his concluding final thoughts, he carefully, philosophically distinguished their entirely divergent approaches to governance. He asserted that while he genuinely respected her formidable, undeniable intellect and her deep, obvious passion for her causes, she fundamentally sought to construct an incredibly expansive, massively expensive governmental apparatus designed to manage and direct every aspect of citizens' lives. In stark contrast, he passionately desired to aggressively minimize systemic barriers, reduce governmental interference, and empower individual agency and self-determination. Above all else, he grounded this entire political philosophy in his grandmother's remarkable stoic resilience, praising her incredible ability to navigate profound, terrifying adversity and raise a family without any reliance on extensive government programs, college degrees, or public recognition. Standing firmly, almost defiantly behind his chair, his voice adopting a deeply resonant, emotionally earned, and slightly roughened texture, he perfectly encapsulated their divergent, contrasting paths. He highlighted her smooth progression from comfortable, stable suburban life to elite, insulated academic institutions, and finally, to the political capital, to confidently dictate policy to the working masses. He contrasted this with his own arduous journey from that very struggling, economically depressed town, through the terrifying crucible of military deployment in a war zone and into the highest levels of the executive branch, with the sole purpose of amplifying the actual stated requirements of the laboring public. He proudly, loudly embraced his provincial hillbilly heritage, declaring to the assembled spellbound crowd that the aspirational, enduring American narrative remained vibrantly, undeniably alive within their specific communities. He stated that this dream required only leadership that finally prioritizes genuine deep trust in the citizens' own incredible capacity for self-determination over the perpetual exhausting and false promises of systemic, government-led rescue. The conclusion of his incredibly powerful remarks was met with overwhelming, unscripted, and deafening adulation from the highly diverse crowd. It represented a profound, almost spiritual catharsis for individuals who felt deep in their bones that their highly specific, painful realities had, finally, for the very first time, been authentically and accurately articulated on a national stage by an individual who intimately, personally understood their precise daily struggles. Representative absorbed this devastating moment with remarkable complete stillness. Choosing wisely not to engage in immediate futile rebuttal, she appeared to fully acknowledge in that silent moment that she had encountered an impenetrable, unstoppable narrative force derived entirely from undeniable, authentic personal history. As the historic broadcast concluded, the cultural impact was immediate, instantaneous, and entirely overwhelming. The stylized performance critique absolutely $12 dominated global digital trending metrics, shattering previous records. While his highly vulnerable, deeply human anecdote regarding profound social alienation at a formal dinner deeply universally resonated with millions upon millions of two eyes, citizens who had experienced similar painful feelings of profound systemic exclusion in their own lives. Subsequent exhaustive media analysis over the following weeks revealed a profound tectonic structural shift in the national political landscape. Prominent commentators across the entire ideological spectrum, from the deeply progressive to the highly conservative, were forced to openly acknowledge the insurmountable, devastating credibility advantage derived from authentic lived experience regarding highly sensitive matters of socio-economic hardship. This new, undeniable dynamic prompted intense, significant, and painful introspection within progressive academic and political circles, resulting in the publication of highly viral, deeply analytical, scholarly essays exploring the severe limitations and political dangers of adopting the language and rhetoric of economic struggle, without possessing the corresponding authentic historical grounding to back it up. Ultimately, the distinguished representative gracefully yet noticeably adapted her future public messaging to focus almost entirely on alternative progressive pillars. While the entire national discourse regarding the true, authentic representation of the everyday working citizen was fundamentally, permanently altered, forever marked by the poignant, unforgettable contrast of two vastly diverse